I've titled the essay The Afterlife, and I recently turned 50, and Bijoy, who was here last week, I think with you guys, said that's an apt title for this point in my life where everything seems to be sort of coming to an end. But the afterlife is something else, and I'll sort of try and explain that as I go. So in his curatorial note for the 2012 Venice Biennale, David Chipperfield wrote, and I quote, "Architecture requires collaboration, and most importantly, it is susceptible to the quality of this collaboration. It is difficult to think of another peaceful activity that draws on so many diverse contributions and expectations. It involves commercial forces and social vision. It must deal with the wishes of institutions and corporations and the needs and desires of individuals. Whether we articulate it or not, every major construction is an amazing testament to our ability to join forces and make something on the behalf of others. Good architecture doesn't happen naturally. It requires a conspiracy of circumstances and participants. While architects can provide ideas and visions, the relevance of these ideas depends on a meaningful engagement with the society they presume to serve. While good architecture is always involved an attitude of resistance to the elements, to the forces of chaos, and even resistance to norms and prevailing tastes, this attitude shouldn't become, as it has so often, the justification for isolation and rhetoric. In fact, the predicament of the architect is at best one of critical compliance. They are both antagonists and service providers," end quote. It is compelling to consider the inherent promise of the unbuilt project, especially competition proposals. The ones usually celebrated as visionary being those produced either as individual speculations or early project proposals yet to begin their journey to realization. These projects, usually symbolized by a provocative first sketch, a representation of a singular vision, are often upheld as the purest expression of architectural ambition. They're seen as unadulterated visions of what could be, revealing an architect's position with regards to the abstract nature of a commission, and holding more value than the proposals which have had to engage with the clients, the site, and other contingencies over time. They promise newness, unencumbered by these shackles, free to imagine provocative new ways of inhabitation. It is my opinion, though, that it is the shared and negotiated vision coming as a result of finding consensus, managing budgets, and spending an adequate amount of time in conversation and contemplation that is of greater value than the pristine, unmediated projections of so many competition schemes and hypothetical projections or propositions. Like Chipperfield says, one is hoping to engage in this conspiracy of circumstance and participants. We must move away from the seductive notion of the creation of architecture as a form of immaculate conception and celebrate it as a result of negotiation and what David Shane calls reflection in action, a form of shared authorship and the outcome of a scenius. The provocation, that first sketch, is the start of this conversation and not, in my mind, an end in itself. I'm a lot more interested in its afterlife. At the risk of an unintentional and unfortunate comparison, I will use two projects to illustrate the value of this afterlife in clarifying and fine-tuning early ideas. One, our own, a competition entry for a public building in Bangalore, which went through a rather long and arduous process in getting built, and the other, an unbuilt proposal, Louis Kahn's Dominican Mother House, which he worked on for 2 years, if only to show that even the great master's work evolved and his expression was focused as a result of his engagement with the client, the physical attributes of the site, and his responses to the contingencies he confronted. In 1965, Louis Kahn was commissioned by the Sisters of St. Catherine de' Ricci to design a place of worship in Media, Pennsylvania. The Dominican Mother House, as the project was called, was to have private accommodation for the sisters and public areas for outreach like a chapel, classrooms, and a library. Kahn spent 2 years on the project before it was shelved in 1968. The Louis Kahn collection at the University of Pennsylvania has around 900 sheets of drawings, sketches, and prints of the project. In Michael Merrill's exhaustive study of these drawings, we see Kahn's We see Kahn's search for the nature of the private seminary and its public elements, his preoccupation with the archetypal form and its composition, and these negotiating with this particular site, budgets, and the evolving relationship the seminary had with society at large. Though unbuilt, the project shows us that it is through these negotiations that Kahn finds that magical plan. It emerges from these confrontations. The early sketches help establish certain recurring themes in Kahn's later work as he begins by falling back on strategies used in other projects. One, the idea of the discrete room as the beginning of architecture and the search for a society of rooms. Two, the role of spatial archetypes, this idea of a very specific, clear, simple sort of shape to stand in for all of the program components. Three, the search for spatial binaries, servant and served, individual and collective, etc., to organize the program. And four, the relationship between structure and light. Kahn was working on institutions, IIM Ahmedabad, 1962 to 74, and public buildings, Bangladesh National Capital, the same time, in the Indian subcontinent at that time. His unrealized project for the St. Andrew's Priory in California, the image on the left, too serves as a close precedent for the Mother House. The Mother House and some of the drawings of the Mother House are on the right-hand side, where the housing, the sisters' housing was enclosed in these very simple rectilinear sort of shapes on the peripheries of the plan, and the public buildings had really sort of very front-of-ground, formal, hierarchical sort of arrangements on another side, separated by a courtyard, so to speak, that then framed the composition. As the plans evolved, the compositional relationships between the discrete rooms was something he had begun working on in the Fisher House, 1964 to 67, where a square volume oriented to the cardinal directions intersects with a rectangular volume rotated 45 degrees to it. The three square volumes linked diagonally at their corners at the Erdmann Hall Dormitory, Bryn Mawr College, 1960 to 65, also show how these junctions become points of access of movement. Working for the first time with collage, Michael Merrill suggests that Piranesi's fictional plan of an idealized Rome, the Campo Marzio plan, an ultimate collage, if you will, may have served as inspiration too. And apparently this wonderful drawing that Piranesi made of an idealized image of Rome with imagined components and real components juxtaposed, hung on top of Kahn's drafting table, and Merrill thinks that may have had some subconscious effect on the way Kahn was thinking about the Mother House itself. Apart from the clear representation of these themes, the early plans show two components of the program: the individual, accommodation for the sisters, and the collective, the chapel, classrooms, library, and the refectory. So these two sheets on the right-hand side, on the top, this is Kahn. He is 65 years old. And just like so many of us architects, he's sitting and drawing out the program components of this project. And it's really heartening to see that even the senior architect starts where probably a lot of us start. So he's working out, the dimensions of these blocks, how much, the corridor width, the kind of rooms, the way that light would come into these rooms, etc. And the bottom plan shows you the sort of formal public-facing portions of the institution, the chapel, the auditorium. There was an auditorium in the early schemes. There's a library, classrooms, etc., etc. And on the left-hand side, and so this idea of collaborative work, this is David Polk, who was a senior associate with Kahn. This is a sketch that David Polk made on one of the first letters that they received. So it's on the back side of this letter. And in fact, this organization that you see at the bottom, which has got a triangle at the bottom and the sort of faceted enclosure at the top, was the diagram that Kahn sort of based the initial schemes on. So all of the public components of the plan were embedded in that triangular sort of shaded area, and the housing was strewn across the landscape in that sort of faceted fashion, and that courtyard between the two blocks became the center of this organization, a bit like the St. Andrew's Priory. It is evident that Kahn is looking to find architectural expression for the nature of the monastery. The individual monastic cells are embedded in the forest, a wall nestled deep and sheltered. The collective shared spaces are up front, archetypal forms, symmetrically and hierarchically organized, and separating these two is a courtyard, a memory of a quadrangle in a monastery somewhere, but filled with trees, obfuscating this reference and further sequestering the sisters' cells. So here you can see on the right-hand side, you can see the cells, the living accommodation for the sisters embedded in the forest, so to speak, and the public-facing functions organized almost as if, copied from a plan of Dhaka or something, which he was, at the same time working on at the office. The first scheme presented to the sisters, in some sense, is like a competition proposal. It accommodates all the program, responds to the site, but more importantly, represents the central predilection of Kahn's studio in terms of the nature of the commission in the abstract. And like a competition entry, this first scheme is not the result of a dialogue with the client, but exists purely as abstract interpretation or as projection. It also happened to be 4 times over budget in terms of what the sisters had as a purse for this project and what this scheme required in terms of construction. And this was a consistent challenge that Kahn was trying to address through this project, the budget for this building. The great value of this archive of drawings and Merrill's studies in documenting Kahn's response to circumstance, the sisters' feedback, a close understanding of the site and orientation, a recognition of budgets. Over the course of 2 years, Kahn struggled to get the project under budget and kept consolidating the plan to reduce its footprint and in turn the amount of circulation. Ideas central to that first scheme persist, but are now constantly being reviewed in response to these contingencies. So Kahn is making, a tighter and tighter plan as he is trying to reduce the size of this. And you can see that the whole scheme is sort of collapsing onto itself. The courtyard is slowly disappearing, and these public components are now occupying that courtyard. And Kahn, this is a wonderful drawing for me because it shows, you can see that on the bottom there is the old plan, and Kahn has what we call down Xeroxed the church, the classrooms, etc. And he's done a sort of 10% reduction in an effort to get it down to a certain area that then would sort of meet the $1 million budget. This was at around 5 million at that point. And so constantly sort of over the course of these 2 years, like so many of us working with these incredible stresses that all projects present. In the final iteration of the plan, the courtyard, a separation of the private accommodation and the public components of the program, is gone. The faceted outer perimeter of the accommodation now becomes a 3-sided rectangular frame. On the left-hand side, you can see that clearly, with the communal rooms at its corners. And the courtyard is now filled with the public program components colliding with each other, as a result of which the plan now is primarily about junctions and open spaces created as a result of the disposition of these buildings. These program components now meet in unmitigated ways, and the buildings have a series of layered ambulatory spaces to help make the transitions from private to public space. The whole organization is also rotated counterclockwise. When you compare it to the first scheme that was presented in '66, the whole organization has now been rotated counterclockwise, creating a more obscure relationship with the primary axis from the north and orienting the front facade of the chapel to the west, which was liturgically correct. This new composition inverts the earlier ideas of a separation of functions and instead signifies a move to a more egalitarian sense of community. Kahn had arrived at a plan that captured, in a sense, the higher ideals of the Dominican order, the inseparability of service and spirituality. The plan showed the vitality with which the engagement with the real world confronted the solitude of the order. This essential understanding came as a result of this long gestation and Kahn's close engagement with the sisters, documented in the letters they exchanged. Eventually, along with the budget concerns, this distinction between the monastery and the larger community became untenable, and the institutional move to get the sisters integrated into society, working within local parishes and engaging directly with the congregation. In her last letter to Kahn, Mother Mary Bernadette, the Prioress General, writes, "It is my unpleasant duty to advise you that after much soul-searching and discussion, we have decided to discontinue our plans for a new mother house. The reasons are many and forceful. Aside from money, which is of course a very real factor, we face at the moment consistently changing attitudes towards the manner and setting of religious life, which opens up distinct forms this life is taking and will continue to take in the future. In these days of re-evaluation, renewal, and restudy, we feel that the complex of buildings we originally envisioned would dictate decisions on our form of life rather than permit us to vary our life to fulfill our vocation amid the needs of today. The dissolution of the commission poses another interesting question regarding how each of us articulates what is to be done as an architect. In the case of the Mother House, it is evident that starting as Kahn did, influenced heavily by his Beaux-Arts education, he was limited to seeking architectural solutions. And the essential contradiction that compromised the commission didn't occur to him or his client. Maybe this 2-year exercise was essential to reveal how the order was to engage with the world. In 2005, a group of senior career bureaucrats and city intellectuals came together to set up the Bangalore International Center. They modeled it on the India International Center in Delhi as a place for informed discussion, public discourse, and cultural engagement. Housed for the first 14 years of its existence within the Sanjay Mohe-designed Terry offices, the center held a variety of public events, many in Terry's small 80-seat auditorium, the crowds often spilling out onto the lawns and streets outside. At the core of its mandate was the idea that these events hosted by the BIC would be free for all and not just for its members. Membership was seen more as a token contribution to allow the center to pursue its egalitarian and democratic mission. In 2012, the center invited proposals in an open competition for a new facility they were planning to build on a half-acre civic amenity site in Domlur, in the eastern part of the city. The site had been allotted to the BIC, and the building was going to be built using funds raised through private donations. This unusual idea of a public open institution built with the help of private contributions and managed by the membership in the interest of the larger community is the foundational principle of this project. We won the competition, and our proposal, a dramatic assembly of mixed-use program, articulated to respond to its small-scale residential context and the neighboring park, was received with much acclaim and some derision. An astute BIC member, in a letter written to the building committee, observed that modern architecture, or the Starship Enterprise as he called it, had crash-landed in Domlur. This response may have been because of the particular massing strategy used on the competition scheme. A floating mast cantilevered out by some 16 meters over a wide amphitheater and a 2-story plinth expressed in iconic fashion the public agenda of the BICA. This open veranda above the tree line from where one surveyed the city and onto which the city projected its aspirations had incredible rhetorical flourish, capturing both the heroic ambitions of the BIC and its open, transparent, and public mission. Soon, though, this heroism gave way to pragmatic considerations, including the ever-increasing requirement for enclosed rentable space, odor from the adjoining stormwater drain, and of course, mosquitoes. While preparing the permit drawings, we realized that BIC's actual site holding was smaller, narrower than the competition site. Given the new dimensions, we couldn't accommodate the auditorium in the width left after the setbacks required for a 4-story building. The scheme lost a floor, and you guessed it, that wonderful central idea, a symbol of the institution, was sacrificed. And so from 2012, we worked on a scheme, and then in the end of 2013, the starting of 2014, we started to sort of prepare for sanctions and realized that the site was smaller, and so we lost a floor in that process. And there are 18 sort of distinct iterations of this plan over the course of those 6 or 5 years before we went into construction. We proposed encasing the building in a frame to retain the scale of our earlier iterations and began moving towards the idea of finding a series of shared spaces contained within this frame, the idea of a rich public realm within the building. And then, sometime in 2015, we developed a slightly modified scheme, seen in the middle, shifting the main entry to one end of the plan, creating in effect a long promenade within the building, connecting the different program components. This fundamental change in the circulation strategy meant that now on each floor, the distinct rooms were part of this articulated and generous public space. The public life of the building, rather than being isolated on one level, as it was in our competition scheme, became the core organizing principle of this new scheme. Rather than merely a rhetorical idea, it now was a lived, experienced condition with adjacencies and connections. Subsequent iterations of the plan cemented the importance of this common shared space. As program was removed from it, the restaurant was moved onto the ground floor, extending the public realm, and new connections were made to the wide setbacks on the east and west. This inner shared space, intimately connected to the world outside through large openings and ample glass facades, was like being in a deep veranda. BIC finally opened its doors in February 2019, dramatically different formally from the competition scheme. Friends often commiserate when they see the finished building, remembering the dramatic formal expression of our competition scheme and its powerful invocation of public space. But we enjoy this expression of an architecture of collaboration, negotiation, and shared ideals. The expression of publicness now is mostly an internal one. Spread over the 4 levels, the meandering, interconnected series of open volumes now became the symbol of community, engagement, and dialogue. Across a cascading north-south section, one is always aware of connections and inadvertently participating in this idea of communion. I would like to submit BIC as a valid precedent for the constructive coming together of many people and the benefits of a long period of gestation. The facility has become an active cultural hub in the city, appropriated in wonderful ways by the BIC and the larger community. There is a sense that the building is a real representation of shared ideals and authorship. Like Chipperfield says, our work as architects involves both a critical resistance, the antagonist, looking at our commissions as the search for deep structure and enduring meaning, but also accommodation, the service provider, listening intently and assimilating the particular exigencies of a commission. Our work finds essential meaning in the coming together of many people, and in this shared authorship lies its greatest value. It is, as Chipperfield says, an amazing testament to our ability to join forces and make something on the behalf of others, an act of profound empathy. The provocation of the unsullied, pristine, unbuilt work reveals to us that which is obfuscated in the hustle of our everyday engagement with the world. But it must be brought to confront this everyday world, for we must search for resonance, for deep structure. In finding common ground, we give life and meaning to what we do as architects. I'm interested in this afterlife, in giving expression to our time, our place, and our culture. And these are not defined by solitary voices. I'm just going to go through a few photographs of the BIC and maybe just walk you through it. So this is the Domlur neighborhood, the stormwater drain on the left-hand side, a very low-rise residential sort of neighborhood on the right, and defense lands on the left. This is oriented to the north. This is a drawing made again by Surabhi, a wonderful drawing that tells you about all of these layers that you encounter in the BIC facade, the inner world of that becoming this idea of public space, of shared space. So there's the facade of the building, and the landscape was done by Varnadhar of VSLA, a wonderful young practice in Bangalore, really softening up the sort of rather severe architecture of the building. This is the main lobby you enter, and you can see these connections through to the gardens on the western side of the building, but it's open everywhere, and so you never get a sense that you're in sort of an enclosed environment. And so this is that sort of common space that you share, and you're linked across that section. And in fact, when you enter, you can see right up to the sky. But the BIC has, over the past 2 years, appropriated the space in various ways to hold exhibitions, for storytelling, for impromptu conversations, for art installations, etc. So it's been a really useful decision to have removed. We had a lot of program in all of these public areas, rooms that would have been rented out for money for the BIC, but the BIC has found real value in this sort of unlabeled, unprogrammed space, which is the heart of this Again, that wonderful landscape. So from within this building, you always feel like you're in a veranda connected intimately to this landscape. This is also now looking southward. There is a water body on the south, and most of the breezes coming in from the southwest and the southeast, catching some of this moisture, rising up through that section and evacuated out from those louvers at the top of the glass. And so they've never used the two-stage cooler that we had installed in this building for the common areas. So it's always open, even in summer, just with this wonderful draft that is invoked thanks to the section and orientation of these openings. This is the restaurant on the left, the common areas on the right. The auditorium is, we did this with Didier Weiss, a sound engineer from Oroville. Sound Wizard is the name of his company, but this is a completely natural sound box. So these plywood panels have been inflected and perforated in varying degrees depending on their position inside that auditorium to help either reflect or absorb sound. So spoken word events don't need amplification, and it's been quite wonderful to have theater without mics and without amplification in that auditorium. It is a small auditorium, and so that helps as well. But it is like a womb-like room, in which it's also multi-purpose, so it can do all kinds of things. The auditorium, from screening of films to dance. It's one of the best, according to one of the local dancers. It's one of the a Kathak dancer who said that this was one of the best floors. It's a sprung floor, which also accommodates dance performances on it. So all kinds of activities in this auditorium. This is the main lobby that you enter with this brick wall, which seems archaic and sort of existing here before everything else was done. This is the upper floor, again, connections up to the top, etc. These are Sangaru lamps, bamboo lamps, local designer from NID just won the Jindal Steel Craft Prize. And this is looking from the topmost floor down, again, a sort of reaffirmation of that idea of connection and a sort of shared community across that section. This is the gallery. This is Madhusudan Chalasani's exhibition at our gallery at PIC. This is the library. When you're up at this level on the second floor, it's wonderful because you're now kind of at that canopy level, and these are wonderful rooms to be in. Again, all naturally ventilated. Of course, there's air conditioning provision in all of these rooms, but very rarely used. This is the passage up to the terrace. And there's my colleague Harshit on the left-hand side, wonderful young architect who worked for 4 years on this project, almost daily visiting the site and coordinating things. And so I want to end with this idea of seniors, the idea of shared authorship, of course, with your clients, but also with all of our colleagues at the office. There's Harshit in the blue shirt on the left. In the middle are two KRVIA alumni. There's Surabhi Banerjee in blue and Pramada in red. So we depend and are inspired by the colleagues at our office. They produce all of the work that we then take a lot of the credit for. And I love, Cyrus Kabiru's wonderful photographs from the Kochi Biennale, where he makes, these glasses out of junk. And when someone asked him, what are these glasses for? They have no lenses. So he says they're not for seeing better, but they're for seeing differently. And I think that architecture really, or the production of buildings, of architecture is really this, the notion of bringing together all of these different points of view and trying to find consensus through that. So the idea of this, that Brian Eno, the famous music producer, talks about the age of seniors versus the age of genius, where, the genius is really the scene making the profound or meaningful work of art. And that wonderful line from Chipperfield's essay, the conspiracy of circumstances and participants. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Bijoy. It was really fantastic. We can now invite Jude for the discussion.
Hi, am I audible, Bijoy?
You are, Jude. Hi.
Hi, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Jude.
Right, so I think it was very interesting that you kind of chose Kahn, who is also known for his institutions and Also, I feel a certain gentle humor in the way that you kind of, put that project along with, a project which changed so much. And I feel what's interesting is through the project, the BIC, you seem to have, I mean, your offices seem to have held on to something which was uh, pretty seminal, or pretty kind of which was in that initial scheme, which was the whole public path which moved through, which now happens through the building. And I'd like to kind of bring in an experience of a consultant we worked with, and he was a graphic consultant, and he did for one of our clients, he did about 120 versions of a logo, and he said after the 20th, everything was the same. So it takes a lot of patience to kind of run through, this whole process of collaboration, and hold on to what's valuable through that whole process. So my question is, we see what has what has been held important through that process. Could you kind of give us a sense of what were the battles, or what were the where did you have to kind of dig your heels in the sand, as it were, and say, okay, this is crucial to kind of maintain within the project? Because I'm sure there would have been negotiation and there would have been back and forth. So give us a sense of, like, what were those kind of push and pulls between architect and client, and or was it actually smooth sailing all the way? Yeah.
No, not at all. Of course, all credit to the client. There was a person called Ramachandran who was the head of the building committee, and he was our champion right through the process. But at the point where the site dimensions changed, this was sort of an existential problem, because for us, at the beginning when we were doing the competition, we had two wonderful colleagues at the office, Kiran Kumar, who is who's a young architect and now teaches in Mysore, and Rohan Patankar, who is an architect now in Delhi. But what we did, and what was very useful at the start of this project, was to write out the 4 or 5 things that were really important for us in this project. And these weren't architectural; these were ambitions, if you will, of how you would register this kind of a project. What was, in a sense, the way Kahn would talk about, the nature of it. What is the nature of this building? And that, just exactly as you say it, this idea that publicness had to somehow, what is public? What is the notion of public space? What is the scale of it? How do you establish it? What is the idea of vantage in public space? What is the idea of privacy in public space, of scale? So this, just in sort of thinking about it, that competition scheme really sort of captured that idea in very, very sort of powerful and rhetorical sense. And so when the scheme changed, when the site dimensions changed, it felt like we had lost everything. That with the change of the site, we'd lost the baby with the bathwater. Everything had been thrown out and we had nothing. And for almost a year, we were running around with a scheme which was the same scheme as the competition scheme, but just sort of now made one floor lower, and struggling again to find any sort of resonance within it. And I remember one particular meeting with the client where we'd gone with 2 schemes. There was one scheme which had a center entry, and it was exactly the same plan, more or less, as the competition scheme, but with one less floor. And there was this other scheme that I had developed with, Nia, and I think there was Rajendra Hegde at the office, these 2 youngsters, and Kiran as well, that we changed the entrance and put it onto one end. And I think for us, that was the sort of big move, that the moment you thought about the interior promenade as the main idea for the project, you captured, in a sense, what was lost through that change in site. And so luckily for us, the client saw value in that. Of course, initially they packed in that common space with a lot of rentable real estate. And then slowly, through negotiation and through cajoling and, all of the tricks that, as architects, we would remove a room, show them a view, tell them, it would be so much better if you can get out into the garden here. And thanks to Ravi, really, I mean, he was able to see potential and value, and he sold it to the rest. Also, the other thing is that because it's a design by consensus, the BIC has 1,000 members. And so what that means is that every scheme or every iteration has to be presented to the members as, here's the cost, here's the project, this is what's going on, etc., etc. And after the first two of these public, which were completely free for all, everybody's saying whatever, and it's random, that I told Ravi that I can't do it. I can't get up there and sort of start talking about this project and have, all of these. And thank God for Ravi. I mean, he said, you don't have to do it anymore. I will do that for you. So I will be the interface between the 1,000-strong membership of the BIC and you. And that, I think, we would have collapsed by the third or fourth meeting if I was to be in front of the members. So yeah.
Oh, right. Good. Thanks. Right. So I think it's a great institution to have for Bangalore, and congrats on being part of that. For it adds a lot to the culture of the city. And so speaking of culture, I mean, I'd like to talk about the culture of practice and the culture of your office and the name 100 Hands, which is, that would have been my question, why 100 Hands? But I think looking at the work, one does not need to ask, because there's clearly a kind of, there is a shared ownership and like giving of credit where it's due. And, so how do you think you see generally architectural practice and the idea of, of course, the whole idea of sole practitioner is kind of out of the window in a certain sense, but also the idea of creative genius, which is like, that one architect who knows, and these juniors who get, thrown sketches at, and they kind of pump it out. So it seems that your practice has a much more collaborative, a much more that sense of shared ownership. So maybe you can talk a little about that in terms of what's the culture of practice that you see grown over the years, and how do you see it kind of maybe across other practices as well?
Well, it does look like it's very collaborative, etc., but we do operate in a sense very much like a lot of other practices. I mean, I do a lot of the initial thinking about things, and then sort of we sort of get people to collaborate after that sort of point where some idea of the project has been established. But sometimes, there are people in the office who run with it, who sort of also are equally invested in. And so when that happens, we try to, in fact, Pramada is a good example of that. When we were doing the IISc scheme, we were struggling away with, the trees on the site, etc. And Pramada independently had sort of done this wonderful sketch of a sort of frame within that forest, where the frame then would be, articulated to accommodate the forest in a way. And that became the sort of driving principle of the project. So it is an open office, but I don't want to pretend that it is completely collaborative, because there is no sort of complete freedom. There is no idea that everything is valid. We are interested in value of what we're producing. So that's one side of it. The other thing is, there's a wonderful TED talk by Elizabeth Gilbert. I don't know if you've seen it. The author of Eat, Pray, Love. It's millions of views, etc. But the thing that a lot of young architects have this burden on their shoulder, that somehow the great idea comes from you. That somehow you are somehow less of an architect because you didn't come up with that sublime sketch that Alto made, or Frank Lloyd Wright made, or Cobb made. That somehow I'm not able to do that, and so I'm not the great architect. When in fact, even from Kahn's wonderful project, you see that it isn't that first sketch, right? There are the traces of what the project is going to be, but it requires so many other people. So this idea of sole practitioner as well, when I was there at the Market Masterclass, he would completely throw out the window the idea of the sole practitioner, because he says that, my contractors are my collaborators, my clients are my collaborators, the site and all of the flora and the fauna on site are my collaborators. I'm taking cues from all of these to then make the thing that is of value. So there is really no notion of the creative genius. Even the great architect or the great master like Kahn requires an engagement with with the client, with site, with budgets, etc., to come to an understanding of what the project really is about.
Right. Great. Maybe we can also open to the questions. I think there's the first question from Shravan. Do you think a design has a certain singular core aspect that will or should stick with? I guess that one should stick with as it evolves, or does this core change and reestablish itself as a focal point of what guides each stage of design? So that's the question from Shravan.
I think there is a core sort of singular aspect. It's what Kahn called the nature of things, and that on some projects you're able to sort of articulate that in easier ways than in others. The BIC, with its own sort of mission and mandate, had a very clear agenda in terms of how it exists in the city. What does it see itself as? How does it propagate, the ideas of free conversation and dialogue? And so from that, you cull the essential, and these are not architectural, this is not an architectural core, like I will operate in a certain way, I will use these materials, this is the structural, that's not what the core is. I think the core is a bit more abstract from that. It talks about public space, it talks about access, it talks about equity, all of these things, So yes, I think it isn't easy to do for many projects, but the BIC was I think a simple project that already had a certain mission and an idea for itself as an institution, and we were able to sort of draw from that. But you do, on all projects, even residential projects, you are trying to articulate for yourself, what the family life is like, what are their predilections, what do they sort of, value, and you try to find some idea of well-being or some idea of inhabitation that then guides you in the way that you design the home. So yes, I would say that there is a core, there is this sort of the beginning of things. What is the nature of this institution or this project?
Right. So another question, I think we'll wait for some more on the chat. So I also believe that you are involved with the larger architectural community in Bangalore to actually look at public space and look at architecture in the public realm. And so could you kind of give a sense of how this started, how it's going, and what are the challenges as someone looking to intervene and make a place for an architectural voice. And by architectural voice, I don't mean in terms of, again, the abstract of but actually having someone with a built environment background, because so many of our policy makers are actually not from those backgrounds, and therefore kind of putting the architect out there and kind of so what is the experience of kind of working across the architectural community and kind of opening that up to public policy or to kind of an engagement with the state, engagement with administration? So is there something?
Well, we haven't done nearly as much as we should. We had early on, a few years ago with Naresh Venkatramanan and Architecture Paradigm, we had looked at a few street intersections and proposed to the city different ways in which to imagine these intersections. So, and that was then presented to the government. There was a budget made, etc. And Naresh really was the front face of that. He's doing a lot of work with the city. I'm only sort of very, very not involved at all in most of that work. What we have been doing a lot in the city, and this is primarily through the Vimal Jain Foundation or through other organizations that I'm part of, recently with the IUDI, is to try and put architectural conversations out in the public realm, either through presentations or exhibitions that then we invite. So we had the Deputy Chief Minister come for the student exhibition of the IUDI inaugural event, and that just getting that sort of mileage or getting them to see what ideas exist, etc., presenting some of the sort of seminal ideas that these projects propose, that I think is quite useful because it sort of stays in there. It's like an inception. It sort of then he called IUDI back. We had meetings with him, and now there seems to be some sort of an MOU that we may sign with the government to review of public works. And so we haven't really done too much actual design work, but we've done a lot of outreach in terms of events and exhibitions with the city. And BIC, thanks to the BIC, in fact, they were always open, and so we've had a whole bunch of public events at the BIC which are architecturally, related to architecture and urban design.
Right. Great. Are there any more questions on the chat, Mamta?
We don't have any more questions right now, but thank you, Jude, for actually discussing and sharing your views too. I would like to invite Manoj for sharing his comments as well, if Manoj is in the meeting.
Hi, Bijoy.
Hi.
I joined a little late because we had academic forum trying to debate out the pedagogic structures for next 5 years and things like that. So, so I joined when you were almost halfway through. But of course, I've seen your work. I graduated way back in '86, and we have learned architecture through looking at primarily Eero Saarinen's work, and Kahn edition came much later. In our understanding, and I feel that this kind of turns are very cyclic in nature. When you look at global architecture, I'm just putting India also into global map, and I see this kind of high key architecture and low key architecture, which is cyclical in nature. And if I correctly read the global perspective on architecture, that the way new emerging architecture that I see is very low key. And I think I find your work also kind of somewhere embedded there, which is, I think, appropriate. So are you conscious of that kind of a trend, or are you making a very deliberate choice to kind of do this?
I don't know if you've seen, there's a wonderful essay that Prem Chandavarkar wrote some years ago called the background in Bangalore, or background in architecture, something like that. And he said that there were these places in the country, Ahmedabad, Bombay, of course, and Delhi, which were at the forefront. This idea of high key. Did you say high key? Like important, like seminal works being generated. And Bangalore has forever been the provincial sort of, the backwater, if you will. And we're happy to be in that sort of, periphery of things. And it's a wonderful essay because he puts together a whole bunch of architects who aren't making big claims about the work. They aren't making propositions or theories. And maybe they should be. Maybe, we should be standing out there. But it is maybe a Bangalore thing that you just sort of have your bisibele bath and have a nap in the afternoon, and that's about it, and there isn't a big. So I don't think about it as a trajectory or as being part of some sort of a movement. It's just the way that we practice. We have a lot of our projects are all commercial projects. We aren't. I mean, the institutional projects are the ones that we sort of have published, etc. But there is a lot of work which is just commercial work, which feeds the office, etc. And these come with their sort of baggage of, challenges, and all we're trying to do is to sort of try and get the most out of those. So there isn't a grand theory or a sort of grand idea of where we fit into the scheme of things.
Thank you. Jude.
Rohan?
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to say hello. Seeing him after time. Yeah, that's all. Bijoy, you are also involved in teaching, pedagogy, to some extent. Also, I was wondering about your, since I'm interested in film, I'm also interested in your other disciplinary engagements. Could you talk a little bit about both your other disciplinary engagements and your pedagogic kinds of interests?
So I'm part of BMS, which is my alma mater, where I studied, and I'm the design chair for the the master's program, which is the Habitat Studies program. It's practically an urban design degree, and I usually take the second semester and the third semester for that. And usually the 2 semesters are kind of roughly divided. The second semester is usually looking at city center, sort of at engaging within the city and looking at the city. And so what my personal ambition has been is to build an archive of information of the city. And so though there are propositions made as part of these studios, it is primarily a documentation exercise. It is collecting demographic data, physical information. And so that's been fairly successful. We've sort of been very systematic about selecting and sort of widening our gaze in Bangalore as well as in Mysore and other parts. And so we're kind of building that up. I've been there for 3 years now. And the fourth semester is mostly a greenfield sort of project. So out in the middle of nowhere. So this has been very interesting because that has brought to bear stuff that I wasn't aware of in terms of the farming issues, the idea of employment, the idea of, any kind of financial, the challenges that are faced by people in the hinterland. And that's been really, really, so both of these, much to the chagrin of my director who wants to see a lot of design, both of these end up in the final review with just maps, and she's like, so what are your propositions? And we're all completely befuddled, right? We don't know what to do because it's all overwhelming. But we're starting to be, so that's, pedagogically not very sophisticated, but it is merely an act of recording what exists. Yeah.
No, because in that sense, the idea of archiving our cities is such an important thing that sometimes I think the act of urbanism is the map is the intervention. Sometimes.
Right. Yeah. That's a wonderful thing that you said, because I was just, in fact, when I was writing the BIC thing, that's when Lacaton and Wessel got the Pritzker, and then I was looking up their work, and so they apparently were invited to design a $20 million food court in some American university. And so they went there, all fanfare, very well-known architects, etc. They spent a week there, and they came back to the college and said, here's the project, and they presented a map of the campus with all of the food trucks, with the menus, with the prices, and they said you just have to arrange some seating, and you for $20,000 you'd get a lovely set of places to eat. So the map is the solution.
Yes. This is really where I think the reason why I'm asking those kinds of questions is that I think even as somebody who teaches architecture, there are certain kinds of things that are called architecture. And I think, you brought up the new Pritzker winners. And if there's one thing, even if to connect what Manoj himself was saying, is that a sort of shift away from the building itself as the object of architectural design. And a need to begin to rethink what does design itself really constitute.
Right.
And that's what I was asking about actually your interdisciplinary sorts of engagements as well. I know, for example, you were part of the Death of Architecture as well, that entire exhibition.
Yes. Yeah, the Death of Architecture was interesting. It was a great provocation for Maniket, and for us, really, it was an excuse again to document. But we were really interested in the sort of informal, low-key, again to use Manoj's term, this kind of really quickly appropriated public space. How do people appropriate public space for various uses? And when we draw our maps of the city, they're completely sterilized, right? They're completely removed. All of this detritus is removed so that you can see the actual buildings that exist. And we force our students to draw them in the way that they experience them, with all of the mess and all of the sort of stuff that has been added on to the cities. Because really that, like the Blade Runner will cleverly tell us, that's where we're headed, that's what urbanism is, this kind of appropriation of what is nobody's. And so the Death of Architecture scheme was really about how we would appropriate using the same sorts of artifacts and components that they were using to make their stalls to now make city-scale interventions. It was facetious to some extent, but it was basically a provocation that we have to think of our cities not in terms of those classical terms of the church and the spire and the fabric. That there's all of this in-between stuff that we don't look at.
I think this idea of the facetious or the humorous is an interesting kind of trope, actually. You see that across architectural history, where the drawing becomes a medium of playful provocations more than anything else.
Right.
I think that is really also where, Mamta must have sent you our brief for this year's Kamla Reja Memorial Lecture Series, the Apocalypse Manifesto. So part of it is that little sly wink, to really start thinking about is it necessary for us to sometimes rethink some of our presumptions concerning architecture itself.
Right.
There's a question.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
go ahead. There was a question on the chat from Somil. Hi, your project's early drawing gestures towards all that rich, complex synthesis. Do you feel the anxiety of the beginnings during early drawings? And it was very intriguing to understand the beginning of the project. It throws light on the topic of how to begin. Could you also speak about something about the other end, when or where to stop? That's Somil.
That's very simple to answer that. When you either get kicked out or when there's no money left, or but I understand your question. I'm just when to stop is a really good question, because I remember when we had our first project ever was a house for a person here, and we got it while we were in the US, and I put in everything, from whatever I had learned in second semester all the way, like everything was in there. There was alto and cob and KRVIA and doshi and staircase, and it was just jammed, it was beautiful. And I remember showing it to this very senior South African colleague, who looked at the drawing and he said, "Wow, that's a lot. That's everything." and maybe you want to go back and just sieve out, and that is the toughest thing to do, because of course, every project you think is the opportunity, and you may never get this chance again to do something of this kind, and then you want to put everything into it. But oftentimes, I think there is in real projects, and this is where the distinction between the provocation and what happens in reality, I think it's really useful that there are these challenges with regards to money, with regards to the site conditions, because these are all the natural forces that then help you modulate the way to engage with the world. Because, sometimes you're just riffing and there isn't any value. So I think it is difficult to know where to stop, but I think there are certain sort of checks and balances in the way that we build in India, that a lot of stuff just automatically gets cleaned out of projects that probably are superfluous or unnecessary. BIC is a great example of that. When we look at some of the early schemes, we can see that a lot of the stuff that was unnecessary was cleaned out, either because of the budget or because of our own time spent on the project. Yeah.
Yeah, Madhura, can you go ahead?
Yes. I would like to thank everybody for joining in today, especially Bijoy and Jude for having the discussion, and the faculty for joining the students. Students and faculty, we would like to request all of you to stay back for the announcement that is happening. Once again, thank you so much, Bijoy, for coming in and having this lovely presentation today. It's fantastic hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bijoy.
Thank you, Rohan. Manoj,
thanks for joining.
Jude, thanks a lot. Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.